All right, good morning. We had a rolling start on day 3, so for those of you here early, thank you very much for continuing to wake up and come see us. The very first thing we're going to do, once we get our slide controller back up, is we're going to talk about some opportunities going forward. We have been paying attention to some of the things you all have been saying, and one of the critiques, if you will, is giving everyone a better understanding of what happens next. What happens coming out of installation next. What are we going to do with the information, all the hard work that everybody's put in. I mentioned on the very first day that we are as closely tied to the Army as we can be at this present moment with our efforts to kind of improve looking forward, particularly with installations. We have installation next. The Army has installation forward. Is that right? Where's Jason? Jason, are you back in here yet? He stepped out. Oh, there he is. No, that's it. It's on him. So, you know, we're working towards these same ends, and the Army has got an industry day that they're ready to announce. And when Dr. Dorby gets back, I'll have him talk about it. But what we're going to do, and I'll talk more specifically about this afternoon, is we've got a challenge coming up. It's a resilience challenge. So we're going to take some of these ideas as primers for the open community, our ecosystem, to come up with some ways for us to improve the installations going forward in partnership with all of you and all those other organizations that are out there. So now that Dr. Dorby is back, we're going to throw up a slide. I'm going to hand him the microphone briefly as he talks about the Army's Industry Day.
Thank you, Colonel. Sorry for my tardiness. There's multiple efforts going on around the services for modernizing installations of the future, multiple efforts that are going on. And we're all at various stages of this process. Right now, you know, Marines are working on their working groups and doing their sensing sessions, and they're doing some fundamental pilots and trying to figure out what the pain points are and what the solutions might be. Army has gone through this process in various iterations. We've gone out and done design charrettes like this to see what stakeholders are looking for, what they need on the ground, what they need at the HQDA level, what they need in sort of the income level as well. On top of that, we've gone to industry. We've seen what industry has out there, what you guys are doing. We've looked at academia and saw what you guys are doing as well. And so from all of that, we've boiled everything down to certain pain points that we've identified across our installations and about 10 use cases where we've identified certain capabilities that we want to explore to then put into these installations. So now we're at the step where we want to move forward, we want to do this, but we want to do this right. So the question is, how do I move from industry into Army? How do I get from what's out there and get it onto an Army installation, and how do I do this correctly? So our industry day and the RFI has been released this week on FedBiz Ops. The solicitation number is up there. The RFI is essentially what are the standards and the requirements that we need to have in place if we're to write an RFP for any one of the 10 use cases that you'll find in the RFI in order to get those into an Army installation. We want to make sure that when we write these RFPs, we write them correctly, and we make sure that everybody who can play in a particular space of the use case has that ability, has that opportunity to do so that we can deliver the best solution for the Army. So the RFI simply asks, you know, what's your experience? What have you done before? Do you have an ATO? Have you gone through that process? What kind of requirements and standards do we need to have in place? What kind of requirements and standards do you need to know from us in order to make sure that we get your tech into the installation? And then the Industry Day event is going to be later spring. After the RFI closes, we're going to go through all the RSVPs and do an assessment of, okay, how much room do we have for this Industry Day, and then we'll send out invitations with the location and the time for the Industry Day event. And the Industry Day event is going to act as a capstone to the RFI, where we're going to sit down in a room and say, okay, here are these 10 use cases, here's what we got back, this is what the standards and requirements are that everybody in this room, you know, seems to agree upon. Is this correct? What do we need to add? What do we need to expand? What do we need to change? Again, help us write the RFP correctly. And then by the end of that, we should have created a level playing field where everybody in that room can participate in the RFP. When they're released for whatever use case, we've prioritized that we have money for, and we want to go forward with, and anyone who's responded to the RSVPs will also be sort of included in that. So you don't have to attend Industry Day in order to be able to compete in the RFP, because you're going to be contributing to standards and requirements. And participation in the RFI or in the Industry Day doesn't guarantee that you'll get an award from the RFP or anything to that effect. We're just doing this kind of sensing to see what it is that we need to do to make sure that we're on the right track. So with that, thank you, Colonel Bolden, and we hope to see you guys at Industry Day.
Okay, we're going to do a little bit of housekeeping before we get into the next step. So this is the agenda for today. With one small refinement. Where we had 11:15 for the solution presentation pitch refinement, we're going to allow the working groups to continue to work and refine their individual solutions. And your facilitators will give you a better guide as to how we're going to transition from doing the real true grunt work of the working groups into this afternoon's presentations. Next slide, please. What you can expect from those presentations is how it's going to break out. So as you start working with the mouthpiece for each group, keep in mind that each group is going to be limited to 20 minutes total. And we want to be able to give everyone else the opportunity, to include our the executives, the VIPs who will be here a little bit later, an opportunity to go back and forth with each group to kind of learn a little bit more about your process, the things that went into it, because you're not going to be able to put everything out there in those 10 minutes. And so that'll give them the opportunity to kind of probe and find out a little bit more. If you have any questions on this, your facilitators will go over this with you a little bit later as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so as I'm continuing to kind of wrap that up, I'm going to invite the gentleman on the screen to come up. So we spent the last 2 days talking about what leads up to this moment. Of how do we get to that anti-fragile situation that Noel talked about yesterday, and we kind of alluded to in other presentations and discussions. The ability to punch back is not a natural state for anyone. You have to prep for it, you have to prepare and train and educate to get to that point. So what we're going to do now for the next 45 minutes or so is all of us at some point are going to have this conversation, but I have Colonel Dave Jones, who is the Deputy Commander for Marine Corps Installations Pacific, Colonel Scott Baldwin, who is the Deputy Commander for Marine Corps Installations East, and then Colonel Joe Williams, who is the Chief of Staff at Marine Corps Installations West. And each of these individuals has been in the installation world for a couple of years now, so they've got some experience, some bumps and bruises, and some scars to prove it. But each of them have had to face a variety of different challenges to the resilience of their regions and the installations that they oversee. And so our conversation this morning is going to talk a little bit about what their experiences are and how they've been successful in actually achieving that punchback state that we've been alluding to throughout the past couple of days. Each of our regions are obviously geographically disparate, but they're also environmentally disparate, economically disparate. So there's a lot of different challenges that each one of them have experienced that should provide us with some unique perspectives. So the very first question I'll ask to the entire group, and we can, for whatever order you want, is what has been the most challenging event to your region, or specifically an installation within your region, that's caused you all to really, as a staff and as a command, really try to sit back, take a breath, and say, all right, how do we move forward with this?
All right, so I'm sure everybody's familiar already with the Hurricane Florence. We've talked about that several times, both in here and I know in our conference group we've covered it several times. But that was our biggest one that we dealt with. But I will tell you, last winter we had a pretty rough winter. We had a destructive weather exercise, not exercise, but a destructive weather event where we had some severe weather came in. It came down and really created a lot of problems for us. And it helped the staff. It was almost like an exercise in how we do our staff work to make sure that we're successful. And it really set us up for success when the Hurricane Florence came through, because most of us had been there through the winter event. So when the hurricane came through, we already had our processes and procedures in place. So, we talked a little bit in our group about exercise and going through the scenarios. And I will tell you, actually getting people together and walking through the actual, who goes where, who talks to who, how do you talk to them, makes a huge difference. So really the Hurricane Florence was our big one. We're still struggling with that, and I'm sure there'll be some questions that'll come up that hopefully I can provide some punch back. My insight on punch back, we talk about 14 days. I have a hard time buying 14 days because I get it. We talk about you're trying to get back up so that you can conduct your mission. Well, I will tell you, from an installation, you have to know and understand your tenant units that are on your installation. You have to know who they are and what their actual mission is. Fortunately for us, we have a 2nd Marine Expeditionary Force, and so all of us as Marines and the civilians that work on the installation, we all know what that means and what they do and what the requirements are to make sure that they can function and operate. So that's the simple one. All the other ones are the ones that can be more challenging. Fortunately for me, I had been the commanding officer, as Dave was, of one of the schoolhouses that are on the installation. We've got four primary schoolhouses that exist on the installation, and they're tenant units, and their mission is completely different. Right? Their mission doesn't stop. Right? That cycle of recruits that are coming through the pipeline continues. A hurricane doesn't mean, hey, look, you got to stop everything, because down at Paris Island and at San Diego, they're not going through a hurricane. So they're still cranking out recruits. So we know that thousands and thousands of Marines are going to continue to flow into our installation. So how do we do that? So knowing and understanding, unfortunately for me, I'd been there, so I knew what that means to a tenant unit and how we have to help them get back on their feet first, right? It's not you think, okay, you got to get the warfighters so they get the planes in the air, get the grunts back out the door. But one of the key pieces there is getting those Marines that are coming in to get their training so they can go out into the operating forces going. So that was one example. You also have your Naval Medical Center that's on the installation. You got to understand what their requirements are and all the other various institutions that are inside of your wire. So again, hopefully that kind of helps. We can set some of the questions up. I'd love to answer questions about either a destructive weather event, whether it's snow and ice, or whether it's a hurricane that was one last time a hurricane hit Camp Lejeune head on or hard like that was in 1996. So you're talking 20 plus years ago.
All right, good morning, everybody. I apologize if I sound like I have a frog in my throat. I do. I've been sick the last couple of days, so if you don't understand anything, please just raise your hand and let me know. So, as Colonel Bolden discussed, all of our installations are different in certain aspects. So if you look at Marine Corps installation specific, we own all the installations from here, Hawaii, all the way through Korea, with a couple of cooperative security locations throughout as well. So from a destructive weather perspective, I think that MCI pack is pretty much good. I mean, we build with steel and reinforced concrete. So, for example, we had 6 typhoons that hit Okinawa this year alone. The biggest one came through with winds over 100 and something miles an hour, and really no damage to any houses or anything. I mean, because the houses are built that way, a lot of the structures are all steel and concrete. And we practice that on such a daily basis, how to recover all our steps, that it's a very smooth process for how we get back up and recover, and how we get everything back up. The thing, though, that we struggle with is being inside the threat ring. And Shay, I don't know if I'm going off target, but when you look at what keeps us up at night, is all of our installations in the Pacific are within the threat ring of China, North Korea, and Russia. And so when you look at that and you ask, how do you take a punch? That's our biggest concern. How do we take a punch and then still be able to force project and move 3MEF and follow-on forces out to get to whatever fight is required, and then still function as an installation with families that are there taking care of them, the regular installation functions, as well as we taking on several different command and control responses that now fall under us. So what we did when we looked at that problem set is we commissioned a study, a CNA study, a Center for Naval Analysis, and they looked at how our installations were structured across the region and it provided some possible solutions from the very expensive all the way down to here's some of the basic things that you could do across the board. So for example, I know there's a communications group out there. A lot of the times our installations are built, where the CONUS are overseas, they were built many, many years ago. And so they were not built, for example, with hardening, with reinforced or double reinforced concrete and different things like that. If you've watched the news, for example, you've seen China has built a brand new base in Djibouti, and that base is very hardened. Several layers of reinforced concrete, steel, underground facilities, whatever. But when you look at that, you look at U.S. bases, that's something that we look at because we weren't built that way. We've had our base in Okinawa, for example, since World War II. And a lot of the buildings that there are since, just after the war, have been updated and renovated, but for the majority of the buildings are still 50s, 60s, 70s construction. Still sturdy, but not necessarily for the threat that comes up. So those are the things that keep us up at night. Those are the things that we work towards. And as I talked about communications, how do we, if something happens or our communications goes down, let's say even a destructive weather event or a different threat, how do we then communicate off the island? How are we able to continue to project power when our communications goes down? So an example of how we've tackled that, we've looked at we looked at portable VSATs that we've put out there. And so in case that we have a lack of communication, loss of communication, our key leaders can still get up and then connect through satellites and still get communication. We can still be moving, and those are portable. So we don't have to sit in one building, we can move across and still communicate. So that gives us flexibility and mobility. Again, just another way we're trying to be resilient across the board. Joe?
Yeah, a lot of the same themes from the other two regions. What keeps me up at night, it's power and water security, communication, and you look around the challenges we have in Southern California. It's a very populated area and surprisingly fragile environmentally. You have fires that, the wildfire challenges we have them. We have fires all over the base. Three a day. Every day through the fire season, and they're very well and adept at responding to those. But there are fires that tax the resources of the entire state and draw resources away from Camp Pendleton, Southern California. Huge rain events, can take out bridges and roads. Earthquakes are a possibility, and so some of these things are not really a challenge. Some of them you don't know when they become you don't know when you're going to get that series of fires or the fire that hits that has the certain wind conditions that go to make it turn that into a critical critical threat is all I'll say. And to get to Scott's point, that what is critical in advance of any of these things is the relationship that we have to form both with the operating forces and the tenants, because they become critical to the response to some of these events and the response to and the recovery. And that's a good partnership that you have to have with the MEF, you have to have with your tenant units. And also you have to have those similar relationships with your surrounding community. Very dense population. We've got a lot of partnerships with the city around, with the cities that surround, the 7 cities that surround Camp Pendleton. So you have to be able to respond and be ready. You have to have partnerships with the utilities to provide power. You have to have and how are you going to get those back up? And your key services, again, I think it was power, water, security, communications. If those goes down, then the rest of the base kind of dies. And the way to do that is through, I think, relationships, roles and responsibilities, and priorities, because in a similar way, the infrastructure is 70 years, 60 years on occasion old, and it isn't that resilient in terms of being able to withstand some of those shocks. So not trying to have a plan for each scenario, but having key relationships as scenarios unfold in order to be able to respond and get back to operating.
When we talk about resilience and being able to punch back any event that happens, Joe, you started to allude to it there towards the end. One of the things that's kind of helped us, I think, across the board from all three regions is the relationship you have with the surrounding municipalities and communities. I'll start with you, Dave. So the government of Japan obviously has a role to play in maintaining the readiness of our forces that are stationed in the entire Pacific, or at least there in Japan. So can you talk a little bit about the relationships that you all have built with the government of Japan in order to enhance your ability to punch back when the time comes?
Sure, that's a great question. So you're absolutely correct. We have relationships with the government of Japan and the government of Korea, and those are intertwined, not only in our security posture that we have in our security cooperation agreements with both governments, but what they are to provide to us. So for example, going back to government of Japan, we do multiple exercises with the municipalities, for example, tsunami evacuation. Some of the areas within Okinawa are in low-lying areas, and so we practice evacuating on a yearly basis some of those low-lying areas, and they have a certain amount of time to evacuate. We become extremely efficient, so we call it the open gate policy, where we'll open gates and we will have thousands of citizens working with the municipality to evacuate through the gates to the other side to get to higher ground, simulating a tsunami warning and then a response from that, and then our working with the Okinawa Prefectural Police, as well as our PMO and the other bases to make that happen. We have agreements throughout, again, with government of Korea for fire support. So, for example, in Camp Mujuk, if there is a fire at Camp Mujuk, then their response is coming from the government of Korea or the local fire department. Colonel Sekou, sitting in front, has agreements and has work relationships with the mayor of Pohang to strengthen those relationships for police support, fire support, and anything else that we have. So it comes down to relationships, but it also comes down to working things that are beneficial to both of us as it comes across. Exercises on a yearly basis, working through all of those issues, the command and control, when would the government of Japan, so it's not just that simple as, for example, let's say there's a tsunami, and the government of Japan just doesn't really come straight to 3MEF or MCI PAC and says, hey, I need help. There's a process where they need to go all the way up through the government of Japan, from the prefectural government of Okinawa all the way through Tokyo, and then from Tokyo across to the White House and down. Obviously, we'll know that that's coming and we'll start to work with them, but there is a formal process that this has to be requested, almost no different than defense and support of civilian authorities here within the United States. And so those are things that we practice and work through to make sure that we're resilient. For base security, for example, we practice in Okinawa working with our Japanese ground self-defense forces, and some of the things that they would do is we partner together in case of, let's say there's a terrorism threat. You know, what would they do to assist their Okinawa Prefectural Police? And this is not just in Okinawa, this is in all our bases in Japan and across as well.
So, Joe, where you all have a slightly different opportunity in that because of the environment of California, you've formed partnerships with both state entities as well as private entities, particularly along the lines of energy and water. Can you talk a little bit about how that depth of building of the ecosystem helps you all to be prepared for those times where maybe we will be challenged?
So I'll use a similar example with the surrounding towns. The fire that happened out east of the base starts pressing through Vista, and a similar thing. You know, the traffic backs up very quickly. It's all channelized, and so we open a gate and then a route right out to the 5, relieves traffic congestion, aids in the evacuation. Interesting thing, people started showing up at the gate with trailers for horses. We have horse country out there. What do? Respond. Hey, we've got pasture land on the base, and put the word out. this gets into communication, and that went around like wildfire. And then it was just belt-fed horse trailers coming in, putting their horses up and evacuating and supporting that. I think one of the things as we talk about this and discuss it and looking at punch back and what does the future look like, we're working really hard to develop IGSAs or support agreements with the local communities, because it does two things. It may not be a game changer in terms of a huge capacity or huge capability that you didn't have before. But if we can understand that the city of Oceanside or the city of Vista has 10 backhoes and four street sweepers and just other capacity, and you say, hey, we can share this capability on a small level, you start to understand the capacity and the tools you have outside, in common with the civilian community. And that gets me to my second point. Do we have any contracting officers here? Fundamental to what we're going to have to do, and I think as we look at the sprints and everything else, how do you rapidly contract for either civilian work or commercial work to respond to a crisis? And I think that there's a lot of work for us to be done. And I was just sitting in the front row thinking about the industry day. I'd love to have my contracting officer standing next to me and go, what is it going to, and probably my lawyer, what's it going to take me to get that onto the installation, and what are the rules, and how can I navigate that? How can I rapidly respond to, and get back to a capability that I don't even have right now? As you see opportunity come through these crises. So, and finally, the policy piece, public policy piece. We have a representative, GS14, who sits in Sacramento, and he's constantly in and out of the legislative sessions. He's constantly in and out of the governor's office, tracking legislation and advocating. I don't want to say he's not lobbying. He's advocating for and evaluating what types of rules, what types of legislations coming out of the state in order to be and advocate for capability and that integration between the state and the installation. So he's a strategic asset up there. He's doing great work, and so from public policy level down to local IGSAs, down to how do I rapidly contract, how do I rapidly get capability for the base or for all the installations to solve this problem. I think is how we go about it.
We'll circle back around in a minute to some of those actions going forward. But Scott, don't want to continue to harp on Florence, because there's a lot more that you've all experienced and everybody's experienced. However, what Florence does do is provide a very good example of how effective the relationships you built with the surrounding community are, because Camp Lejeune specifically was in a position to help the greater Jacksonville area after the hurricane, and basically, demonstrate our ability to punch back even against the most, daunting natural disaster. You all were very successful and have been successful in helping to rebuild the area around you. What gave Camp Lejeune and the MCI East team the ability to be able to contribute like that, while also at the same time focusing on the base?
Right. It's a great question. So, General Offer kind of, when he made the decision that we were not going to evacuate the installation, there was a lot of pressure coming from a lot of different angles. Hey, when you evacuate the base, he said, look, we're not evacuating this installation, and there were several reasons. One, because you have to be there to take the punch, right? You can't run away. You got to stay there and take the punch, and then that allows you to stay standing and do all those things you need to do to help the installation to recover. The other piece was we needed to be there to take care of the surrounding communities, to help. We have the assets and the capabilities to do that. We're as most of the larger installations, right? We're our own city there. We make our own water, we make our own power, we have our own sewage treatment plants, we have our own public works, we do all our own, everything. So we needed to be postured and ready with the assets and the manpower. We got a lot of strong Marines that can help to go out there and clean up around the surrounding communities. So we did some high water rescues with Amtrak with 7 tons to go out there and help the folks in the local communities. So that was a lot of his decision making. It was the right thing to do. It wasn't to prove how tough we were as Marines to be able to stand there and take a Category 5, what we thought it was going to be, but to be able to be there and available. You have to be there. People will say you can't fight. You can't fight a hurricane. Well, I beg to differ. The organizations and the people that stayed and were around and in their either office buildings or in their residences when something happened, whether it was a window that broke or the shingles came off or something blew out, they were there to get the water out, and that was the key. And if you didn't have anybody there, that's where a lot of the massive destruction occurred. So, along with not evacuating, he and Lieutenant General Hedlund, the 2MEF commander, got together and they made the decision, we're going to allow people to voluntarily depart. Right? These are non-key essential personnel, so it wasn't in order to evacuate, but if you wanted to leave, you can leave. But understand that the surrounding community, the rivers rise, and when that happens, all avenues back to the installation are cut off. And we truly believe this is the safest place for you to be because of all the things that I already talked about. So a lot of people left, and power went out. Water got into houses just by virtue of I know you heard we had 35 inches of rain. Well, hard rain comes all the time in a lot of different places, but we had about 30 hours of sustained winds of about 80 plus miles an hour. So when you combine those two things together, it creates some serious issues of water getting in through all those little cracks and crevices. And then when you have the power go out, it's North Carolina in September and hot and humid. And within hours you get the mold and you get all the damage to the ceilings. And so when people came back from evacuating, they came back to either office spaces or houses that were severely damaged. So the partnership with the local community, and I'll go back on kind of what Dave said, is it was interesting. We have a great relationship with Onslow County and with the local cities around Camp Lejeune. Great relationship. But I'll tell you, when all this started to go down, everybody went to their own fighting position. And the base did, the city did, and the county did. And they're not, the city and county aren't connected. Right? They weren't necessarily talking to each other any more than we were talking with the city or county. And so what happened was it caught Jacksonville by surprise, it caught Camp Lejeune by surprise, and I'm sure some of the other cities. Onslow County issued a mandatory evacuation in big print, because that hits the press, and then in small print for all the unincorporated areas. Right? So that doesn't include all of Onslow County. The cities weren't evacuating. Well, the headline said mandatory evacuation. Well, we have a lot of people that live in Jacksonville, and when they saw that mandatory evacuation come out, they dropped everything and they left, including they left us without drivers for our fuel trucks, without folks to work in the mess halls, without folks to work in the commissary. And guess what? When all the rivers rose and flooded, they couldn't get back for almost 2 weeks. They couldn't get back into the installation. So you can imagine, some of the challenges that we ran into, not just us, but also the city. They had the same challenges. So, it really taught us a lesson, and I'm not sure why we do it all the time in warfighting, right? Is we have LNOs, liaison officers, at your adjacent and higher commands, and so we quickly realized, oh my gosh, we don't have anybody out there that's actually feeding us, real time intel. So, we quickly fixed that at the city level, at least, not necessarily the county, but.
That's actually a really good segue into where we're going to try to take this next before we go on to ask others to conversation. You all have laid out how we've had to deal with this in a variety of different ways previously. But going forward, one of the things, especially with the audience that we have, we can start to put into people's minds is if And this is a carryover from another area of the installation next overall theory we're working on. That is the concept of that digital fortress that you've kind of heard some people allude to, and building a larger area of depth to what it is that we have to go about and do. A lot of folks around the country and the world are looking at smart cities and how to become better smart cities. But I think that you all have demonstrated that we have the resource or fountain, a source of information and experience that they can learn from. But part of this, what I'm trying to get to is by pushing out and pushing those liaison officers out, there are some things that we can maybe teach our surrounding communities while at the same time bringing things back to them. So as we look forward and try to decide and influence decision makers as to how to improve our situation so that we are more resilient, what do you think that you're going to need from those other partners in order to make you all more resilient and be able to punch back in our main mission of generating sustained conduct?
Okay. I'll take a quick stab at this first. Well, money for us first, and that's the cure for all evil right now. It's funding, and it's just the reality. Now, there's a big wish list, and I'll tell you kind of what some of the things that are on there. But our struggle is getting the money to actually make this happen. Because let's just face it, in a warfighting organization, the focus is on the warfighting piece. And the installation normally will take the back seat. So if there's got to be a sacrifice somewhere or risk to be taken, a lot of times that's going to be taken in the installation. And so we have to struggle with that all the time with a reduced budget to try and make sure that we're continuing to get ahead and make our installations more resilient. And we just can't do it without, and I'm not talking small funding, we're talking just alone for our communications infrastructure as we looked at this, just to get our communications infrastructure up to what we believe is at least operational and in line with today's requirements was about $600 million. And that's just for Camp Lejeune. So you combine that, you put Camp Pendleton, all the others. We're talking billions, and that's just in the communications IT. And IT, that's our number one piece, is our communications and infrastructure. Whether it comes from lines that are coming in, the inside the wire communications. That's kind of our number one piece, is so that we can talk and communicate. The second piece is our actual facilities, the buildings that we have. They're all old. They've all been built. So we built up to 202K a decade or so ago. All of those buildings did great. They did great because they're new construction standards, and they were able to sustain the damage much more. They were much more resilient than the buildings that were built back in 1950, 60, 70. And so those are kind of our two real key pieces right here, is comm infrastructure and then the actual structural facilities.
Before I get to Joe or Dave on that very same question, answer, a bit of education for those that may not be aware. So what Scott was alluding to, 202K, was the Marine Corps grew to 202,000 Marines as a result of our involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan. As we did that, we also happened to grow our footprint in order to accommodate all those Marines. But in order to grow that footprint, the installation side of the house wasn't actually provided with the additional funds to sustain going after that. And then when the Marine Corps came back down to 187,000, we maintained this larger amount of footprint that we had to sustain. So I think what's been staring us in the face since before we got here is, the biggest punch that we've all taken has been by virtue of resourcing. We're now in the phase of trying to punch back through these creative mechanisms of the infrastructure reset and doing events like this. So as we look to start punching back in the limited resource world, where do you all think we can get the greatest gains in partnership with folks here or elsewhere in order to evolve the installations to be that next generation installation?
Maybe I'll approach it from this side. Scott broke it down into two. He's got two big problems, and I look at it a different way. I got lots of problems and not a lot of money, right? And so, I think about it in terms of, and to get to your question, Shay, is if I listed out all the things that aboard all the installations in MCI West or even in MCI Con, you start looking at those almost by line item and go, you know, that adds up to a big number. Some of those are pretty small, or some of them are pretty big numbers, but as we go through our acquisition process is as antiquated as our infrastructure. And so trying to make it through that acquisition process, starting with, okay, what do you need? First, I got to set my list of requirements. Then I start through then I got to go out for, then I got to go through solicitation, bid, selection, and then, through that whole process. But sometimes, when you're in the middle of the fight, you're thinking about exactly what, you're relying on your experience, you're relying on what you know, you're relying on trying to get these things through, and then you're in some things you don't even go for because that's too much money to never get there. So you kind of drive yourself to a traditional or long or inefficient response to or solution, when I would like to see this process kind of turned around and to get to the smart city discussion or forums like this or forums with industry and with the communities, civilian communities, that I'd like to go with a list of my problems and say, here's all the stuff that I need to find a solution to, and now you've opened up the solution to a broad array of smart people, innovative people who go, oh yeah, we did that in Wichita, and this is how we solved that problem there over time. And so you may get some very interesting solutions, and then maybe they're not big problems. Maybe there's, let's tell an example of, I've got a water tower sitting right above Wire Mountain Housing. It was built in 1952. Our inspectors won't go up to inspect them. I should say this, but inspectors aren't going up the ladder because it's unsafe. The ladder is rusted and ready to fall off. And so we took that water tower offline, but that creates exposes us to a tremendous threat because that's what gives water to the Wire Mountain Housing as well as firefighting capability. Well, some of our engineers got a little creative and they said, well, why do I need to pump water up there when I can just pump it straight across from another reservoir? We took about, in the reservoirs, a $12 or $17 million Milcom project that we're hoping to get funded in 25, 26. This small group of people, kind of on their own initiative, went to our GF director and said, hey, I think we can do this and create this solution. They laid the foundation, put a skid pump in. We're able to bypass that water tower, and in about 9 months, with about $800,000, we found a solution locally. And those are the kind of little projects that start pulling those big resource requirements out of the top line, where you can really focus on things that, Scott said, hey, we really have to build some buildings. We really got to get out of those things that are falling down and inefficient and are creating increased capacity requirements, power, water, maintenance, and resources. So if we can find little, almost bespoke solutions to these line items, and maybe we find out that how we're conceiving of the problem is absolutely the wrong way to think about it. Then we may be able to optimize our limited resources in order to do the things we really need to do.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with everything Joe and Scott said. From us in the Pacific, when that buildup occurred for 202K, as Colonel Bolden alluded to, none of that funding really made it out to the Pacific. And so we were not beneficial to any of those new buildings that came out through that building spurt that came out. One of the things I think that is essential for us, I think across all the installations, is to get rid of buildings that are old and no longer useful. And I say that by consolidating. Marines are like, I say this in all jest, Marines are kind of like cockroaches. If you give us a big building, we'll fill every space in it. Even if we don't need the space, we'll fill it and we'll hold on to it because we're like, you can't get me out of this building because I need it. So you'll have a a Lance Corporal with an office this size because he can, and he won't leave that office because he needs it for his job. And I say that in jest, but it's true. And so, part of what we're doing with what's called infrastructure reset is looking at those buildings, our footprint, and trying to have a definition of what it is for an infantry battalion. What kind of space do they require? We normally just take old buildings and we make it fit to what we want. But that's not really wise or prudent from a financial perspective. And so I think as we continue to go forward, as we demolish all of these buildings, and it costs money to demolish as well, then it will help our top line by reducing maintenance funds for buildings that are inefficient and old and putting them into buildings that are new. The other thing that I would say is not every building has to be a smart building. This is just my 2 cents. A lot of times when we build buildings that are smart, it creates, some buildings have to be. And you can have certain things that are smart across that makes a building intelligent, but you don't want the building sometimes too smart because it costs you manpower. You have to have a higher level of manpower facilities to maintain it, which means more managed payroll, more civilian costs, and more cost to the building if something breaks. So I think as well as intelligently looking at the facilities we have and figure out which facilities need to be what, and then build that facility to that structure. I think from an industry perspective, one of the things that the military in general struggles with is energy. Energy costs never seem to go down. They always seem to go up. And as we, whether it's more housing or industrial areas on our bases and stations draw a lot of power, and that cost, that money comes out of our operating budget. So the more that we can become energy efficient, the more that we are able to save money that we can use towards warfighting or installation issues, but also it helps us to become more resilient. So, as we were talking about here, if I can unplug a good chunk of my base from the civilian grid, because we draw power from the local communities, not only here in Hawaii, but in Korea and Japan as well, then that allows us not only to be resilient, but also it saves us lots of money. And so those are the things that we're looking towards. What are those projects that we can do that can help us to become more resilient? How can we take care of renewable energies and cut down some of that power requirements and power those buildings that may not draw that much power, but are necessary through some type of renewable energy, and then pull them off the grid. So we're always looking for, especially where we are, we're always looking for the ability to become better and more efficient. And the one thing that we deal with more so in OCONUS as a base that's in a foreign country is all the political dynamics that go along there. So we also have to take that into consideration as we're dealing with the future, looking at plans and policies, is what is that host nation government thinking or doing, or what policies they may be implementing within their own future, and how that will impact the base and our future as well.
Okay, so we've got about 15 minutes, and I want you all to get involved in conversation. So while you think of a question to ask here in about the next 30 seconds or so, I'm going to ask each one of you for an opinion. And I want that opinion to be in the form of a 1 to 3 word answer. What technology, organizational change, or process do you think is going to be most beneficial to give us more punching power in the future from an installation perspective?
Okay, I'll take a stab. I'll go with energy resilience.
I would have to say communications infrastructure.
I think efficiency.
Okay, who's got questions? First row.
So my question goes to the money question and the contracting timeline question. So you all have bases in areas that have been hit by natural disasters, hurricanes, wildfires, typhoons. Those surrounding communities, the states typically have natural or state of emergency declarations of emergency, which bring in disaster relief funds. Do you guys have access to those funds? Because those also come with more expeditious contracting and things like that. So it would seem like something that could assist you, but I don't know if you have access to those.
So you're talking like FEMA comes in, or we don't have access to the FEMA funds. What we did specifically was we were able to get a quick influx of about $150 million. We identified, hey, look, we need this money and we need it now. And this was to do roofing, right? To get roofs back on buildings, just the bare minimum. And so what we were able to do is we were able to load up a global contingency contract, and we were able to just throw, you know, and so they did open up some of the lanes for expedited contracting to allow us to make it more efficient. So really, it kind of went to a one-user, you know, a global contingency contract where we just dumped the money in there and then parsed it out to make sure, you know, by getting trailers leased, you know, for temporary offices and the roofing. And so that was kind of how we went about it.
One second, I just want to answer. So getting back to your money question, the money that was pushed out came out of the Marine Corps operating budget. So we didn't get any influx of money. Marine Corps looked and said, where can I scrape up $150 million? And you know what? You guys who had money plans here, now you don't have it. I'm taking that and I'm putting it. So
following on that, I mean, the other thing, so there's the disaster relief funds, and then agencies can submit requests for supplemental appropriations in support. So do you guys access those or put in kind of requests for those funds?
Yeah, I'll take it from my end, and Jay might have, you know, more insight on, because it's now up to the second half level as they're getting ready to go to Congress. We worked very hard to put together, in concert with MCICOM, to put together a supplemental package, right? Anticipating a quick supplemental to get us back up in, because it's going to take years, and every day, every week, every month that we wait, you know, all of a sudden that memory of how bad it is goes away, and then it's a lot harder for us to convince people that, hey, look, it's still bad, right? So we got the supplemental package ready to roll, and there are a lot of different levels it has to go through to make sure that it's ready, and then the government shutdown. Right, and so there's been a lot of churn as we kind of sit and wait for them to kind of figure out, you know, what they're going to do with this. So we're kind of bystanders right now. Jay might have probably better insight as he sits closer to Congress up there at the Pentagon. God bless you.
So in kind of the theme of this, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the stay standing part is money flows, resources go, and it's the getting back to operating, right, to Scott's point, which is all of a sudden the focus gets, you know, starts to wander other places, and you're finding that at least I think you have 5 years, 10 years of recovering, and how do I fix that without, if the $3.5 billion doesn't come through, how do I fix that? How can I have these quick solutions? So that's kind of separating those two out.
Yeah, I don't take very much time. But one of the things that we, from a service perspective, need to get better at is our ability to punch back, and that comes by form of process and policy. And so we, in the future, intend to have it be a little bit more ready when something like this happens to go and say, hey, OSD or Congress, we need X. It baffles me. We don't have insurance on anything. So, you know, Jack, what's your question?
Mine's a money question as well. So, with the limited resources that you do have, I'm very curious to know how you balance prioritizing the 110 list with increased resilience, increased readiness, and, you know, facility maintenance, and all the four levers of investment.
So that's a great question. One of the things that we do in SAPAC, and all the installations do this, we have basically an installation board where we look at requirements from the operational level. Each of the installations, for example, under MCI PAC, will hold meetings with all their tenant commands. Those tenant commands will determine, hey, these are my top functions. For example, here in Hawaii, it may be marine aviation logistics. Building is so old, it's not functional anymore. We need a replacement. So the installation here in Hawaii will rack and stack all of those, determine what is the most important, and the installation has other issues. For example, electrical distribution. Rack and stack those, and then it comes up to the regional level at MCI PAC, and we sit and we vote and we rack and stack. not only from a military construction perspective, but also an FSRM or facility sustainment, restoration, and modernization perspective, and look at both of those pots of money. We know how much money we have, we know what the cut line is, and then we rack and stack those and say, okay, this is what we think is going to be the best bang for the buck, the most important things that we need to do. Sitting with the operating forces, once we're done at a region at the 06 level, it goes to the GEO level at the region, so the MEF commander, all the other GEOs within the region sit down and then agree that that list makes sense, or they make some changes depending on what goes on, and then that goes from there up to headquarters Marine Corps through MCI-COM, and then to headquarters Marine Corps, and they sit the board, and that's kind of how the Marine Corps then comes out with, okay, here's our rack and stack for military construction, which is usually small, just because they're funding bill, but here's what money is coming down for each of the regions, rack and stack on your FSRM.
So this I think it comes down to an interesting point of view. Like, we have the assumption, it kind of gets to my earlier comment, we have the assumption that we have to replace all those buildings. And to piggyback on, Marines will fill up whatever space they have. But put it this way, we need to leapfrog from our assumptions of, hey, we're going to recapitalize all these buildings, and then we're just going to make them all new, whether they're smart or not, but we're just going to make all new buildings where the old buildings are to replace the old capacity. And we have to think in a different way. We have to leapfrog out of that, because the money's not going to be there, right? There's billions and billions and billions of dollars worth of recapitalization requirement, and it ain't there. So instead of, this gets to some creative ideas, disruptive ideas. You look out in town, go back 30 years, how was corporate America creating office space? They buy a building, or they lease a building, and they stick their organization in the building, right? Or small companies the same way. Now you go out and you're like, hey, I can rent an office, right? I don't have to rent this, I don't have to rent the space. There's common areas, those smart leasing, those smart places. You show up, I need an office for 3 days. It needs to be this big. I need this capability in there. What if we turn this around again and said, it's not the installation that's going to try to build buildings for the operating force. You go, hey, if we have a certain capacity more of installation during building base, we incentivize the collapse of the space required, therefore collapse the requirement for MILCON, therefore collapse all the energy, utility, and sustainment, and all that other stuff. And maybe you have to incentivize that to the tenant units, but maybe they pay for their space, and they get a budget for that. If they can collapse and make it more efficient, they get to use that for something else. That's just throwing it out there. I think we got to leapfrog the idea of hey, we got to go back and recapitalize from 1950 out to 2050, because we're never going to get there. So maybe some creative ideas on how to do that, both policy and development-wise, is something we got to think about.
Let me just put just a final piece on the money issue. When it comes to a disaster or a surprise that comes, right, the timing of it means everything. And so again, I talked about, we're waiting for money to start flowing. Well, when you're talking about something this magnitude with this number of projects that are sitting out there, it's a pretty massive load. And the big concern is how or can we spend the money that they give us? And again, the timing is, if they give us the money, if they wait for too long to give us the money, we can't spend it in the amount of time that we're required to spend it. So those are a lot of the challenges that we're going through right now. We're really starting to get a little bit nervous as we continue to start to get ready to move into the third quarter here pretty soon. It's got to be spent by the fourth quarter. We have a plan, but
I got time for 2 more.
yeah.
So, gentlemen, thank you for your comments. Appreciate it. It's amazing the amount of experience and knowledge you have. So, my question, quick 2-part question is, how would you characterize the amount of knowledge sharing amongst your 3 commands? And not just among senior leaders like yourselves, but throughout your commands, because of so much experience that you all have in different parts of the world. And then the second part of that question is, what are the mechanism by which you do that knowledge sharing? Conferences, papers, cadence call, teleconference. I mean, what is the mechanism by which you do that? Thank you.
Okay, just real quick. So we really don't talk, to be honest with you, because we're so embroiled in our own world, and they're so different, right? You know, and all of us have lived in each other's areas, so we understand the idiosyncrasies that are associated with the East, with the West, with the PAC. So we don't really talk to each other, to be honest, at our level. Now, the generals that are in charge, right, we feed them all the information, and they do talk. They talk on a regular basis. They talk on a daily basis with general colonies, and I know they communicate, you know, via email and phone calls occasionally to make sure that they're tracking kind of with what's going on. And then we have the forced functions of the installation and logistics board, the marine installations board, that we're required to come and bring our issues and our subjects so that we can sit and talk about them. 2 weeks ago, they had the commanders conference out in Camp Pendleton, where they sit down and all the commanders and their threes and their facilities folks came and they sat down and they talked about important issues. So that's kind of how we're sharing the knowledge of what's going on. But it's just it's interesting that it's just so different between what Joe deals with out in Camp Pendleton and what Dave deals with out in the Pacific, you know, and then me out in, you know, lazy North Carolina. We talk about, what about capacities, right? In North Carolina, there's not much capacity of construction or line haul or anything like that in the local and surrounding areas. It takes 2 hours to get from I-95 to Camp Lejeune. I mean, and that's a lot different from when you take exit, whatever it is, off of I-5, right into the main gate of Camp Pendleton. You know, and then he has, you know, the challenges of dealing with, foreign national truck drivers and companies, and so just a lot of different challenges that are out there. But we share information, but it's not necessarily us talking, but it's us talking through our generals.
You know, just one thing as well, as Scott said, you know, from the email perspective, MCI.com takes a roll-up of our sit reps and sends it out to everybody, so we all see that. And then for example, our facilities folks talk with MCI.com and on I think not weekly, but probably bi-weekly conferences that they talk from a facilities perspective as they look around the regions. So our action officers are talking at various levels. So I hope that answers your question.
It's an interesting comment, and I appreciate the confidence. I don't know if this joke will work, but we all slept at a Holiday Inn last night. You know, none of us are traditional installation officers. We all came out of a different, MOS. So my first exposure to being in an installation was 18 months ago. So it's a rapid learning curve, and I think that is something that we talked about. So I really applaud that you have an opportunity to come and put this kind of group together and to solve problems together. Commanders conferences are good. It's information sharing. It's all that stuff. But as I said the other day, in the operating forces, you have operational advisory groups. Everybody shows up, you solve problems, you prioritize across your platform and across Aviate Pilot. Here's our top 10 list of things that we need for resources and environment behind it, project it out into the future for 30 years, and then all of aviation gets bundled up, and then that creates a real true priority list, not just for infrastructure, not just for resources, but for how do we plan this out as a command. And so I really applaud this, and I think this is what that feels like to me. So.
Nolan from Oversight Board in Puerto Rico. One comment and one question. First off, shared misery is a force multiplier. The commonalities between what you guys are going through and what we're seeing in the reconstruction of why spread economic reconstruction of the island is eerie. So I'm glad to hear that this is not a unique challenge. I'm going to glom on what you're talking about, that you're basically trying to punch back the environment in which you're at is widely different between all of your installations and your AORs. And therefore, I'm going to take the leap that requirements are better defined at that, at MCI East, MCI PAC, MCI West level. Question, has there been any thought to enabling some policy decisions to enable those commands to leverage non-traditional avenues for resourcing? I'm talking OTAs, investment projects, whatever it may be. Because your comment about, waiting for the money to come in and the one-to-end stack and then, have a lengthy milk-on process is exactly part of the problem. Whereas, smart cities, not everything is going to be able to be structured as an investment project. But I think a lot of the challenges that your installations go through can be. Has there been any discussion at Department of the Navy on down to your commands on really saying, gloves off, let's look at an OTA, let's look at an unsolicited investment proposal, or those types of things to fix these challenges?
Cheating because I'm not actually a member, but we have created an organization within the headquarters to do exactly that. It's called Installation Works. The name is intentionally the same as SoftWorks, Defense Works, GAF Works, because it goes and looks at as platforming our ability to do these things. And so when I say platforming, I won't reference the book, but leveraging all of those other resources out there is what's going to be key to going forward. And it's particularly with the other transactional authority, there are certain, you have to have a certain level of acquisitions authority in order to be able to do that. We're working on that right now. So within the headquarters, we are trying to do that on behalf of the entire enterprise. The regions are slowly evolving to be able to do that. Like I think, Joe, you're going to be standing up a similar type office on the West Coast soon. And I know that we have a fourth region. It's not really a region, it's just one base. But Quantico is establishing that as well. So we're starting to look at OTAs, SBIRs, STTRs, vendor demonstration agreements, CRADAs, all of those things to kind of short circuit what normally would go through the normal acquisition process or the JSIDS process. I won't pretend like I know what that acronym stands for. You do, I don't. But that's what we're trying to do from a headquarters perspective. At the individual level, what are you all doing down at the local level to try and short circuit our normal milk-on process or something along those lines?
Well, from an MCI PAC perspective, I think we have some unique challenges in that arena because we're overseas. So I don't think that we're doing anything at this point in time. We're looking at ways that we can get better, but we have some unique challenges by being overseas. If that makes sense.
Yeah, as you're asking the question, I'm thinking, because I've talked to several people here that are, industry is chomping at the bit to come help, and they really are. And I know it's not all, it's all out of goodwill. I mean, so I get that, but at the same time, right, we can use that help. But right now, as we're trying to punch back, right, and we're trying to get this supplemental, the way this is Baldwin's opinion on this is that trying to go out and try and figure out ways to get around that and usurp the process for this or that may muddy the waters a bit when it comes to the entire package that we're trying to push through up in to get funding. So again, that's Baldwin's opinion on that. Doesn't mean that I'm not going to take that and go back and talk about facilities folks and say, hey, what's out there that we can do now in order to help. So.
I think there's a couple different, trying to formulate this in a way, but I think that there are things out there, like there's programs out there. There's got to be policy, there's got to be some strategic vision, there's got to be some culture change, and then there's got to be some capacity, I guess. And because there are programs that exist, that like NEPA, National Navy Energy, I don't know the acronym, looking at energy resilience projects that are unique, that can help the installations. Immediately suspicious. They came in and said, hey, here's what we think, here's a great project we think. We coordinated with a private company, but now you can see the heads at the table on the installation side. No, we're not doing that. It's like, why not? What is the issue here? And then our headquarters even, what are they trying to do? Is that the best use of the land? Is that you get mired in these, you get deflected, and sometimes it just gets too hard. So we've got to find ways, those strategic, if you put them in buckets, broad things of energy, water, I'll use my own energy, power, security, and communications, and then have what's in the environment that is on the books in terms of formal programs, and then use the freedom to operate within, in those buckets, what the ecosystem is, to go out and do your own, make some of your own luck. And then there's a mechanism by which you really got to put those mechanisms, those are the entryways into, different levels. Now we've got to be very careful because, I'm advocating too many PowerPoint slides. Let's bring it back to the beginning of this, which is, hey, I need forwards and triplicate things in different ways possible.
Just real quick, so, getting back to an example of a project that we're doing with industry, working with MCI Com, they have, I won't name the name of the company, push out the company to do an assessment of our bases and stations in the Pacific and see what are the things that we can do to get more efficient HVAC systems, facilities controls, different things like that, and come up with a proposal. And included in that proposal would not only be replacement and modernizing those issues, but also the maintenance tail on that. Not just, hey, I'm going to build it for you, and then I'll walk away and then you're stuck with trying to fix it, but having that expertise resident available to take care of any issues that come up under the terms of that contract. So that's an opportunity for us to partner with industry there. And I know we're in it, but one of the things I think I'd like to see, I'm glad that our Army folks are here from IMCOM that came in, and I'm definitely appreciative of that. I think from an installation perspective, all of the services, what I would personally like to see, for what it's worth, is all the installations have similar issues because we're all basically do the same things in different ways. But as a group, sit down, within all the services and come down and talk about some of our challenges and some of the ways that we can learn from each other in a much larger setting as we go forth. So I thank the Army for being here, and I definitely appreciate your time.
All right, so as we wrap up and get you back into your working groups, the last thing I'll kind of leave with before we thank our panelists is to Noel's question there at the end. One of the most creative ways we're going to get around this and make it go faster is the fact that you all are here. It's partnerships. And the things that we can get accomplished with partnerships and collaborations are going to far exceed anything we're going to be able to do on our own. And frankly, finding avenues and resources like you were talking about earlier are the things that we just don't know enough about that through those partnerships we'll kind of get to. You all, thank you very much. There is the diversity of experience across our different installation regions is confounding at times and daunting. So the fact that you all are able to put it into context for all of us to understand, I think, has been very helpful, especially as we go into this last part of the symposium to get ready for this afternoon. But thank you all very much. Tell your commanders, thanks for letting you guys come out, and I hope that you all are able to pull something from the rest of the audience. But just join me in a round of applause, please.